Azalea, ace in the hole. The jaws of death. A life on the streets has hardened Azalea, leaving her cynical and callous. Fighting to survive, she taught herself to hunt and kill, honing her skills to a fine edge. Working out of the Blackjack's tavern, Azalea has carved out a reputation for herself as one of the best mercenaries in the pits. In contrast to the anarchy and disorder that surrounds her, Azalea carefully selects each contract, going to great lengths to secure a flawless execution. While Azalea has come a long way, she has yet to realise that she is just one small cog in the giant, decrepit machine of the pits. Slings and arrows. It was always cold and damp in the pits, the underground caverns hidden well away from the reach of sunlight. Industrial waste tainted the water an inky green, coating the cavern walls in a layer of oily copper residue. Left to the mercy of the pits, abandoned children lurked around every corner, scurrying through the shadows like rats. Tiny skeletal figures hiding in alleyways, dangerously desperate, clutching makeshift weapons in their shaking hands. The squeakers fought like the vermin they were, teeth bared, ripping into flesh with knife and tooth and nail, clawing out eyes and tearing away skin. While feral and vicious, they are still little more than pests to the denizens of the pits, an insignificant speck in a sea of anarchy. Hiding in alleyways and beneath buildings, a nameless girl shivered in the shadows, her nights passing in a haze of fevered dreams and stiff limbs. The chill never left, cold set deep into her bones, ragged clothing doing little to protect her from the damp, diseased air. Shaking hands and blue lips were a close companion of every squeaker. While others died around her, the tiniest scraps of luck allowed her to survive, saving her fate for another day. A sickness that finally loosened its grip, a scrap of food dropped near the edge of the alleyway, a tattered coat peeled from an abandoned corpse. The smell of death, fetid and threadbare, clung to her every pore, both a warning and a promise. Surrounded by the dead and dying, she watched as other children succumbed to the dangers of the pits. Hollowed cheeks and bloated stomachs, lying still within the shadows. Beaten and bloodied, fallen next to the corpse they'd been fighting over, their hands still curled into fists. Slumped against a wall on the main streets, eyes staring blankly, ignored by anyone who walked by. Sometimes she came across the remains of a small skeleton, stripped of even their flesh by the desperate and the dying. She tried to learn from everything she found, poking at the remains of those around her. Don't steal from the taverns, don't go near the mercenaries, never remain in the open, avoid the brain and the organs, never drink from the river, don't go in the water, don't go near the dregs, avoid the travelling merchants, don't ever get caught. She learned to bury herself in dust and dirt before sleeping, digging a sleeping space for herself beneath foundations. She learned to climb onto rooftops and travel above where she could watch without being seen. She learned to create makeshift daggers from broken glass, how to avoid being noticed, which dump sites from metrics weren't monitored. When she found the bow, she learned how to carve new handholds in the wood, spent weeks firing at a makeshift target. She tied cord to her arrows and went down to the water, spending hours attempting to spear a fish. It was not luck alone that kept her alive. She learned from the mistakes of others, taught herself new skills, studied the adults to find out what separated her from them. Where they got their coin, what they spent it on, their habits and routines and equipment. What allowed them to survive? She studied the mercenaries that emerged from the taverns, bearing pouches of talics, their weapons always at hand. Some became stronger, bigger, more powerful, bearing the mark of a spade and 3 daggers. She followed one back to his main hideout, looking up at the sign of the tavern. She watched everyone who visited the building, taking note of which ones seemed to be the most powerful, where gangs rose and fell, where other mercenaries died. These were the ones that continued to come back. And so she set her sights on blackjacks. Cards on the table. Her palms scraped against stone as she collided with the wall, pushing herself into a nearby alleyway. Footsteps echoed down the alley as her pursuer kept running down the street, straight past the small silhouette shrouded in the shadows. Azalea slowly got to her feet, looking down at her grazed knees and scraped forearms. Other than the healing gash on her leg, she had no wounds, nothing broken, just a few scrapes and bruises. As she leant against the wall, clutching the copper coin to her chest, she glanced up at the moor stretching out above. Buildings climbed up the sides of the cavern walls, pillars of rock illuminated with crude, steam-tech lanterns. At its height, a sliver of golden daylight was barely visible, the only sign of time passing above ground. Launching herself forward, she rushed to the end of the alley, following the sound of lapping water. The docks smelled of rancid fish and damp wood, the earth closest to the wharf, coated in a thin layer of water scum. Azalea slipped between the warehouses, gaze fixed on the tavern sitting at the end of the wharf. Her mouth began to water at the smells wafting out of the open door. Hot fish head stew, pickled eggs, offal cakes, jellied trotters, and dark ale. Through the glass, she could see a pouch of coins pass hands, copper and silver gleaming in the lantern's light as a mercenary began to count. 2 giant burly men stood watch just outside the open door, arms crossed, weapons within reach. The taller of the pair was built like a brick, skin ashen and chalky, with a wide jaw and deep-set eyes. At his side lay a baseball bat studded with nails, chunks of hair caught in the metal. The slightly shorter man had thin, greasy hair with a thick moustache and crooked teeth, a machete leaning against the wall behind him. His short sleeves revealed a tattoo inked on his upper arm, depicting a black spade with 3 daggers piercing its centre. Azalea gathered herself, coin pressed into the palm of her hand, and approached the door. The guards turned to face her as one, giving each other an amused look when she cleared her throat. Before she could even attempt to cross the threshold, one held up his hand. "Get lost, squeaker. This ain't a charity." In response, Azalea held out her hand, revealing the copper coin. It glistened faintly in the lamplight, coated in a deep, dark red. "I've got the talics. Just want to buy some fodder." The men burst into laughter, one of them wiping his eyes while the other pointed at her. "You got coin?" Moving closer, surprisingly quickly for someone his size, he snatched the coin from her hand and held it up to the light. "Look at this shit, Moray. One of the mites got rich." Azalea started forward, hands stretching out for the coin he held between his fingers, and falling short. Looking down at her, he clicked his tongue. "Can buy a feast with that." They both cackled. Before she had the chance to react, he'd already turned and tossed the coin into the water. A flash of copper in the light, and it was gone. "Fucking Egypt, you gonna buy a crust or what?" A hand grabbed the back of her neck, hauling her up into the air. "Look here, you pest. You aren't allowed here." Writhing in his grasp, she spat at him, grimacing when he just chuckled. "You're lucky we ain't selling you for scraps." Unceremoniously, he dropped her onto the pavement, the pair of them staring down at her as she scrambled to her feet. Gaze flicking to where she'd seen the coin, she barely hesitated before running straight for the water, diving in after it. Behind her, she could hear the men laughing, cackling to themselves as they returned to their post. Azalea surfaced a moment later, choking on the putrid stench of chemical waste and rancid fish, wiping water scum from her eyes. With a deep breath, she dived back under, her hands scraping along the silty riverbed. Stones and scales and bone fragments caught under her nails, scratching at her skin. When she surfaced the second time, the men had already returned to their posts, the small squeaker long forgotten. Diving back into the water, she pushed past the brush of ice-cold skin scraping at the riverbed once again. Just as she was about to surface, something latched around her ankle, tugging her down. Her frozen fingers found a shard of glass, brandishing it like a weapon, slashing until she could surface once more. Gritting her teeth, Azalea dove again. Finally, she felt the smooth, cold surface of the coin against her fingertips and broke the surface of the water with it clasped in one hand. She hauled herself back to shore, collapsing on the stony earth with a small gasp of relief. For a moment, she simply lay there, coughing, trying to catch her breath. As the nausea began to ease, Azalea turned her head to look at the tavern, lips pressed into a thin line. "Worth a try, but I'll find another way." She would find a way inside the Blackjack's tavern, one way or another. Then, all she had to do was get herself a contract. The lanterns cast a warm glow in the deep depths of the pits, wooden boards creaking beneath her feet as Azalea stepped closer, eyes locked on the tavern. An oversized coat hung off her frame, secured by a thick leather belt looped twice around her waist. The dagger at her side was strapped to her hip, almost as long as her forearm, its hilt marked with an unfamiliar design. Two burly men stood guard just outside the tavern's door, arms crossed. Watching them, Azalea carefully withdrew a bottle of Blackjack's whiskey from within her coat and opened it, tipping a small amount out onto the ground. Producing a vial from her pocket, she broke the wax seal, carefully pouring it into the bottle of whiskey. Lifting her fingers to her lips, she whistled sharply. A couple of squeakers appeared from a nearby alleyway, one quickly scampering onto the other's shoulder. Adding a trench coat and a hat, she gave them the bottle of whiskey, eyeing them warily as they made their way across the street. "From the boss," the fake man said in a completely unconvincing attempt at a low voice. Grimacing, Azalea watched warily as the two guards turned to each other and laughed. If this failed, it was going to take her months to get the coin together in order to try again. "Thanks, man." One of the guards took the bottle, nudging the man beside him. "I was just getting thirsty." As the two squeakers slowly made their way down the street, disappearing into another alleyway, the guard cracked open the lid and began to drink. Between the two of them, the guards had finished off about 1/3 of the whiskey before they started to sway. Azalea waited patiently watching from the shadows as the men slowly began to succumb to the draft, slumping against the wall and sliding down onto the ground. Once they'd both fallen asleep, she crept across the street, darting through the front door. Azalea carefully made her way over to the bar, one hand on her bow and the other on her purse. She knew better than to look anyone in the eye, glancing at the other patrons as she pushed her way past, slowly moving toward the contract board she could see against the far wall. Alongside scraps of paper and crumpled notes were the infamous contract cards pinned to the board with tarnished copper tacks. Before she had a chance to look through them, however, she caught a glimpse of green out of the corner of her eye. Someone was slipping through the crowded tavern with ease, patrons seemingly parting for the man as he drew closer, his mass of curled brown hair crowned with a single feather. "You lost, kid." As he came to stand next to her, he gave her a once-over, clicking his tongue. "Bit young to be in here." "Looking for a contract." Azalea watched as the man raised a single, perfectly plucked eyebrow. He considered her for a moment before chuckling, gaze flicking to the bow she had slung over one shoulder. "Really? Any experience?" When he saw her eyes narrow, clearly suspicious, he grinned, fluffing his hair with one hand. "The name's Greenbird. I own this joint. You want a contract, kid? Gotta go through me." "Yeah, done a few jobs. Just finished a big one yesterday. Killed a couple of men too." After a moment, Greenbird burst into hysterical laughter, chest heaving as he flapped a hand at her. "Oi, sunshine," he wheezed. "You gotta be fucking with me. You killed a man with those toothpicks. We got ourselves a real professional here." Wiping a tear from his eye, Greenbird shook his head, slipping one hand down the front of his corset. "All right, I got a job for you. Been needing someone real special for this one." With a chuckle, he withdrew a single card, holding it between two fingers as he extended it to Azalea. She took the card from his hand, staring down at it with a small frown. A sketched illustration showed a small dark silhouette hanging upside down by an ankle, 5 arrows piercing their chest. Beneath it, a large dark stain marred the bottom of the card, smelling strongly of ink and copper. "Get some kids running around here, young ones on the streets. The patron wants someone to collect them. Just take the kids to the wharf house at the end of the docks, push them in the door and close it behind them. Door only opens one way. They can't get back out, so you don't need to worry about that. Just deliver the kids, and that's that. Patron wants at least 10, but will pay a bonus if you can manage 15. "What?" When it came out a little too shrill, Azalea cleared her throat, curling her hands into fists as she tried again. "What for?" "Well, you know what the docks are like. Lots of workers, lots of jobs, lots of water. Maybe they're looking for some extra hands. Maybe they want someone to hold the lantern. Maybe they're going fishing and want some extra bait." He howled with laughter, slapping his thigh. "Who cares, kid? Make up some cute little story about them going upside to have a picnic or being adopted by some rich family out of metrics. Whatever helps you sleep at night." There was a long pause as Azalea stared down at the card in her hands. Eyebrows furrowed. She looked back up to Greenbird to find him watching her, expression blank as he stared down at her. "And this is the only job you have?" "Look, kid, it pays 15 coppers. Bonus is another 10. You want some coin? This is what I got. Either take the contract or get out." When she didn't immediately respond, Greenbird reached out to take the card from her hand, chuckling when Azalea immediately pulled it out of reach. No, I'll take the job." "You know the warehouse I'm talking about? Good. Get it done, come back to me when you're finished. Oh, and let those 2 slackers outside know that I want to see them.
I don't appreciate my men taking advantage of a chance to sleep on the job.
You mean... With a wink, the man stalked away, smoothing out the wrinkles in his corset as he returned to the bar. Azalea looked down at the card in her hand, adorned only with a crude drawing of the warehouse door. She knew where some of the street urchins slept. With a decent plan, she might be able to lure a few at a time, but... Her hand slipped to the small bag at her side, feeling the half-wheel of cheese she'd bought just 2 days ago. This contract could get her even more food, maybe a decent pair of boots. Might not be that bad. Maybe they're just looking for workers. Dock workers get fed. It's got to be better than living on the streets. Tucking the card into her waistband, Azalea exited the tavern, making her way back to the little hideout she had beneath a nearby inn. They die all the time anyway. This is no different than starving or drowning or freezing. I need this more than them. A bird in the hand. Walking into the tavern, Azalea was greeted by the familiar sound of a high-pitched cackle. She looked over to see the green-haired girl seated at her usual corner, giggling over several vials of questionable substance. Shaking her head, she walked towards the counter, placing her contract card onto the countertop. Greenbird turned toward her, acknowledging her with a nod. He placed a pouch of Talix on top of the card, then slid a different contract card onto the counter alongside it.
I have something else for you. One of the gangs is causing some trouble. They keep triggering the tavern's defences. I'm getting fucking tired of getting their blood off the walls. I'll give you 10 silvers for their leader's head. With a sigh, Greenbird waved her off, already dismissing her to attend to the busy tavern. Weaving through the crowded tables, she slipped past the guards at the door, keeping a close eye on a nearby group of mercenaries. Once she was clear, Azalea ducked into an alleyway, withdrawing the contract card from her pocket. Flipping it over, she found a single mechanical arm sketched onto the front. A skull nestled just above its elbow. Arms dealers. It made sense. She'd had run-ins with a couple of its members on the streets. They were exactly the kind to throw themselves at the tavern. Fucking cults. At the very least, members of the arms dealers weren't hard to identify. Surveying the area around the tavern provided a number of possible targets, and the visible difference in the quality and complexity of their fake arms made it easy to identify their role within the gang. Choosing a man with a plain, immobile copper arm, she slipped a sleeping draught into his whiskey and waited until he was snoring in his makeshift bed. All things considered, it was a little too easy to kidnap him and tie him to a rooftop. The man glared up at her from underneath his mop of greasy, curly brown hair. He spat at her, laughing wildly, while the remaining drool dripped down his chin. Even with several fingers missing, he refused to speak. A few minutes later, when she'd finished disposing of his corpse in the water, she inspected the slowly sinking corpse with a frown. Azalea was going to have to go about this the hard way. Over the years, Azalea had befriended a number of contacts across the pits, ranging from merchants and squeakers to mercenaries and alchemists. Having such a wide variety of contacts meant that she could gather a variety of information. A merchant, a mercenary, and a drunkard could all give her completely different intel on a target. However, when she visited a few of her contacts, not one of them had any information to give. While they'd heard of the arms dealers, or seen them around, nobody could actually provide anything beyond that. Azalea made her way to one of her most reliable contacts, who lived in a small shack on the outskirts of the moor. As an information trader, he was usually more reliable than anyone else she called on for intel, and was also willing to accept jobs from her when the target was a little more difficult to find.
It was just a pity it had taken as long as it did to meet him. She could have used his experience when she was first starting out as a merc. Knocking on the front door of his shack, Azalea waited, listening as sounds within abruptly turned into silence. When it came to security, he was almost as careful as she was. Usually it took him a minute or two to check that it was her and that she'd come alone. Perfectly on time, she heard the clunk of deadbolts sliding back against the door frame. The door opened just enough for him to peer around the corner, one hazel eye peeking out at her.
Azalea! Didn't expect you for another couple of months yet.
Opening the door proper, Barton waved her in, brushing back his greying hair with a grin.
Not that I'm not happy to see you, of course.
As she entered, she glanced around the room, noting the new shelves.
Yeah. Needed some more space, you know. Gotta keep notes.
For some reason, the man insisted on keeping notes, though they only ever seemed to consist of rough sketches of people's faces. At best, they were barely recognisable. At worst, they looked like he'd coughed river water onto the paper and set fire to it.
You want some whiskey? It's blackjacks.
Of course it was. He never bought anything else. In answer, Azalea retracted a detached metal thumb from her pocket, handing it to him along with the contract card.
Ah, this is from one of those arms dealers. Crazy sods.
Barton paused, looking back and forth between the card, the thumb, and Azalea.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Azalea raised an eyebrow.
No, I mean it. Last time you got me involved with a fucking cult, I lost me ear and 2 fingers. They tried to boil me, you hear? I want nothing to do with those cultists.
Silently, she placed a pouch of Talix on the table.
No, I'm not doing it. Have you seen half the weird shit that's been happening around here lately? I don't need this shit.
With an exaggerated blink, Azalea added a bottle of blackjacks.
No, I'm not fucking with cults. Never again.
It's not a cult.
They chop off their own fucking arms. Only cultists are that dumb.
Azalea took a seat, staring at him pointedly.
You're really fucking busting my balls here. I want to retire, you know. Want to go up to Metrics, find me a nice robot and settle down. Can't do that if I'm missing me damn head.
When she continued to stare at him, he gave a long, exaggerated groan, flapping a hand at her.
All right, fuck, Azalea. What is it with you and them cultists?
Barton reached for the bottle of blackjacks, popping the cork and taking a long swig. With a sigh, he slammed the bottle back onto the table.
Right, what do you need? Full shebang? You going for the arms of the operation, the head, blackmail, maybe some connections?
Azalea lifted her hand, slowly dragging her thumb in a line across her throat.
You're going straight for the head, huh? All right, let me see what I can do.
Shaking his head, he took another swig of the whiskey, sighing heavily.
Fucking cults.
She started by employing some squeakers, sending them to tail groups of arms dealers and report back. That done, Azalea began with the second step of her investigation. Alongside their own prosthetic arms, the arms dealers had earned a reputation for replacing the limbs of those that crossed them. Rival gang members, traitors, double agents, and anyone who failed to pay their dues on time often disappeared, resurfacing several days later with tiny, doll-like arms. Azalea found that many of them refused to talk to her, fearing further retribution if they crossed the gang a second time. However, 2 of them were willing to talk. One could confirm that the arms dealers had multiple warehouses and secret hideouts around the pits, but had never visited any of them. The other was a previous member of the gang, but had never heard of a secret base or the name of the gang's leader. Facing that dead end, she resigned herself to commencing step 3. With every member of the arms dealers possessing a prosthetic arm, she was willing to bet the gang needed a lot of biomancy supplies, something that few others in the pits had need for. It was all too easy to get the information she needed out of the merchants, tracking the shipments across the pits. Kneeling on the edge of the rooftop, Azalea looked down on the warehouse below. It was heavily guarded by arms dealers, each man carrying at least 2 weapons. Working around to the closest point of the building, she propelled herself forward, landing lightly on the roof of the warehouse. This close to the guards, Azalea ducked down, keeping a careful eye on the proceedings below. Through the glass, she could see shelves lining the warehouse from wall to wall, all filled with steam tech weaponry. Taking note of the layout, she crept her way down to the edge of the roof, gazing at the guards below.
Yeah, gotta be there 'fore dawn. The harvester wants us ready with the goods. Better start now then.
The harvester? Azalea frowned, watching the 2 guards as they turned and walked inside. Better follow them. She watched silently from above as they worked to pack the crates full of supplies. One by one, they took them down to the waterfront, shoving them into a boat sitting nearby. Yet when the time came for them to travel, instead of coasting along the perimeter of the moor, they travelled straight to the edge of the cavern. They're going to the tunnels. Cursing under her breath, Azalea sank back against the metal, hands clenched into tight fists. There's no way I can follow them. There aren't any other boats near here. I just wasted 3.5 weeks on finding out the leader's fucking name. Shoving her bow back into its position on her back, she stalked to the edge of the roof, throwing herself in the direction of Barton's hut. Hopefully, he'd have some kind of information for her by now. Except when she caught sight of the area where his little hut sat, she immediately came to a halt. The front door was missing, ripped off its hinges, heavy footprints dug into the soil in front of his house. One of the glass panes had been broken, and she could smell the faint scent of smoke in the air. After carefully scouting the area, Azalea made her way toward the hut, sending an arrow flying through the broken window pane. When all remained still, she slowly entered through the front door. The tiny living area had been completely trashed. Barton's bed, his chests and shelves had been upturned, their contents scattered about the room. Blood covered the walls in streaks and splashes, as if it had been deliberately thrown around. In the centre of it all sat Barton, or what remained of him. His corpse was perched on a chair, his removed limbs lying nearby, in their place. The humerus bones had been sharpened to thin points, his eyeballs skewered onto the ends. His legs were replaced by sticks of dynamite, his detached head pinned to the wall behind him. They'd left his eye sockets empty, the trails of muscle left dangling down his face. His skin hung off him in tatters, revealing the dark glisten of muscle underneath. In some places, the bones burst through, the points of his ribcage piercing through his abdomen. It looked like at some point his stomach had ruptured. In addition to the sharp, acrid scent of bile in the air, she could see it coating what remained of his clothes. Shit. Jaw clenched. Azalea stepped closer, ignoring the pungent smell to the air around the corpse. Emptying his pockets, she found 3 coppers, 4 lockpicks, and a piece of flint, tucking them into one of her pouches. The rest of the clutter she left, looking around the room to check for anything else she could use. Fuck.
Barton was a rare find. I don't know how long it'll be before I find another information trader like that.
Her hands curled into fists, eyes narrowed to dark slits. Useless. Armed with no leads, no clues, her contracts in hiding or dead, and her only information to date, the harvester's name, her hand was forced. Azalea pulled the contract card from her pocket, clenching it in her fist. There's still one thing I can do. Greenbird stood at the bar, his face set into a deep frown as he looked over the tavern. Most of the tables were empty, as mercenaries having long since made themselves scarce, along with most of the tavern's usual patrons. The Blackjack's Tavern was one of the best established contract grounds in the pits, and no other mercenary group could possibly hope to compete. As a result, Greenbird had lived through multiple attempted coups, maintaining control of the tavern through a well-established instinct for when things were about to take a turn for the worse. And an empty tavern always meant that trouble was brewing. With a long-suffering sigh, Greenbird ushered over one of his staff, gesturing to the door.
Hog, get Moray and Jackdaw from outside. Cobbs, you gather the mercs, as many as possible.
While Hog nodded, running to the entrance, silence followed Greenbird's command.
Cobbs.
Greenbird turned just in time to see the man in question collapse to the floor, snoring loudly. He bent down, feeling the man's pulse with 2 fingers. Fuck. Listening carefully, he heard the sound of a body hitting the floor outside, a sure sign that Hog had succumbed to the sleeping draught as well. Gathering his skirts in one hand, Greenberg turned and crossed the room, one hand on the gun at his side. Just as he reached the back door, it opened, revealing 3 men standing between Greenbird and his escape route. The tallest of the 3 stood with a careless swagger, lips stretched into a grin. Dressed in his pinstripe suit, his greasy hair slicked back, he could have almost been mistaken for a citizen of Metrix if the facial scarring and burns marks on his one good arm hadn't given him away. With a nod, he gestured to the men standing either side of him, their guns pointed directly at Greenbird's head.
Drop your weapon, birdie.
Reluctantly, Greenbird dropped his gun, gaze fixed on the apparent leader of the group. Behind him, he could hear the rest of the group enter the tavern, their footsteps echoing in the now empty room. A glance over his shoulder confirmed that all of them were also bearing prosthetic arms and steam tech weapons.
Planning on doing a runner, were you?
The man laughed, shaking his head.
Nah, that ain't gonna fly. You're staying right here. Take it you're in charge of these half-wits.
Greenbird drawled, chuckling darkly.
I don't remember inviting you into my tavern. My tavern,
the man corrected, gesturing to the room around him as he stepped closer.
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm known round these parts as the Harvester, head of the arms dealers, and now owner of the Blackjack's Tavern. You? The Blackjack's Tavern?
Greenbird laughed.
No fucking way. You couldn't hold this place down for 5 damn minutes before it fell apart. You ain't taking this place from me. And how you planning to stop me? Your mercs are long gone. We got past your defences and we've blocked off your escape route. I know you don't have any tricks left up your sleeves.
The Harvester paused, looking at Greenbird thoughtfully.
You know, I've made arms before, but I don't think I've ever made someone a wing. Been thinking about it a lot, actually. What do you think? Wood or copper?
The Harvester's obnoxious laughter filled the tavern, shoulders shaking face slowly beginning to turn red. Greenbird watched silently, eyes narrowed, lip curling into an expression of distaste. Yet, as he watched, he noticed a brief, faint flash of light, the signature gleam of an arrowhead flashing in the shadows. Raising an eyebrow, he took a quick look around the room. 14. With a sigh, the harvester wiped away a non-existent tear, flapping a hand in Greenbird's direction.
Get him out of here. I want him strung from the rooftop.
Just as one of the men placed a hand on Greenbird's shoulder, he froze, making a strange wheezing sound. Greenbird glanced down to see an arrow embedded in the man's chest, piercing his lung. With a gasp, the man fell to his knees, one hand wrapped around the end of the arrow as blood dribbled from the corner of his mouth. 13. As the woman on the right went to step toward him, an arrow struck her, piercing the soft flesh just behind her temple. Blood oozed down the side of her face, rapidly staining her skin a dark shade of crimson. A moment later, another arrow pierced her throat, her eyelids twitching as she collapsed to the ground. 12. With a shout, the arms dealers leapt into action, backs to one another, as they looked to the shadows, trying to find their attacker. The harvester shouted orders, ducking behind the counter. Yet even as he tried to corral his men, another two fell, shot down before they could draw a breath to shout. 10. Greenbird slowly began to back away from the chaos, watching as the arms dealers began firing randomly, spattering the tavern walls with bullets. A lit arrow streaked through the room, a trail of orange light, striking one of the men and instantly lighting him on fire. His screaming filled the room, blocking out the sound of two more arrows finding their mark. 7. 5. Azalea's face flashed in the lantern light as she kicked open the tavern door, pulling back her bowstring and loosing another 3 arrows in quick succession. The man closest to her gurgled as he dropped to the ground, blood trickling down the lines of the wooden floor. Another arrow struck through one man's eye, piercing through the socket, his one good eye rolling back into his head as he fell. 2. As the remaining arms dealer turned on his heel, aiming his steam rifle in her direction, Azalea had already loaded another arrow into her bow, taking aim. The arrowhead easily pierced his chest, a sharp whistle escaping the man as it perforated his lung. With a wheeze, he collapsed to his knees, clutching at the arrow as he tried to breathe. Closing the space between them, Azalea grabbed the man by the hair, pulling him up to his knees. A silver dagger flashed in the light as she slit his throat, dropping him unceremoniously. 1. Finally, the harvester was the only one left, his gun held aloft as he ducked out from behind the counter. The instant he appeared, before he had time to react, the thwack of a bowstring sounded as an arrow pierced his skull. This one was slightly thicker than the others, the fletching longer and wider. As the harvester stood there, frozen, his skull suddenly detonated, sending chunks of brain matter, blood, and skull fragments flying across the room. Greenbird slowly raised one hand to wipe the blood splatter from his face, his expression thunderous. There was a strip of skin dangling from his bodice, the harvester's hair still attached to the piece of scalp. Pinching the hair between the tips of his fingers, he flung it one side, expression twisting into a look of disgust. Azalea, slowly crossed the remaining distance, the clack of her boots near silent against the wooden tavern floors. Sidestepping a smoking corpse, she stared silently at Greenbird, her grey eyes sharp as she raised a single eyebrow questioningly.
Using me as fucking bait? Really?
He scoffed, gesturing to the tavern around him.
My tavern's a fucking mess. My patrons have all been scared off. Most of me mercs are long gone. Do you have any...
Azalea remained silent, extending a hand towards Greenbird, the contract card held between two fingers. The tavern owner shot her a death glare as he made toward the bar, cursing all the while.
Tavern's neutral ground. They shouldn't have been here. Shouldn't have known about half this shit they knew.
He looked over to meet Azalea's deadpan gaze, his expression dour.
How did they get that information?
She shrugged in response.
There,
he spat, tossing a pouch of talix across the counter.
There's your coin. Now get these bodies the hell out of my tavern.